You've connected us with employers, you've thrown amazing fundraisers, and you've come to our benefit. And most recently, Linda Kingman served on our Capital Campaign Committee. And thanks to a select group of KUC donors and a very generous anonymous donor who pledged a $150,000 matching grant, KUC raised more than $300,000 for our future home.
Wow.
Which is amazing. And I do want to add that the public campaign for that is this spring, so you haven't missed your opportunity to support it if you still want to. So that has been just some of the many ways that Kenilworth has been with this work and welcoming the stranger for decades. And as we shift gears, I just want to share a very brief highlight from a recent trip to the airport where we welcomed an Afghan man who had served the US military abroad. And he was arriving from Germany. His wife and kids are still in Greece, and it's unclear when they will finally be reunited. And he said that when his plane touched down, he said, "I thought I'm all alone in this country. And when I came out, you were here." And that's where our work begins, is from that moment when people land feeling alone, and instead they're welcomed by folks like this church and by RefugeeOne staff, and walked alongside for the months and years to come. So, with that, I'll let Jims introduce himself.
All right, so my name's James Porter, and I'm the Manager of Communications and Advocacy at RefugeeOne, and it's great to be here with everyone tonight. Thanks for your hospitality and having us, and for being here on a kind of cold and rainy night. I've been at RefugeeOne for about 5.5 years, and it's been one of the greatest, really, privileges of my life to be able to work there. To work with refugees has really been just life-changing in so many ways. It's a work that I really care about, and I'm grateful to people like Sara that have kind of showed me the ropes over the time that I've been there. But as we get started tonight, we just kind of wanted to get in the mindset of what it means to be a refugee, right? What it means to be a newcomer. And so as we think about that, I just want to have a quick conversation, and would love to open this up for conversation to anybody who's willing to share, but want to think about times in our lives where we've moved to a new place. So maybe some of us are from here in Chicago, and we've lived here our whole lives, but maybe it was going to college or moving to a new place, having to move for work or because of our partner's work. But a lot of things come up when we move to a new place, right? So there's some questions here on the screen. I'd love to just see kind of what comes to mind for you all when you think about this. So what happened when you moved to a new place? Why did you have to move? What did it feel like to be new? What was the most challenging part? Who were your first friends? When did you first start to feel at home? Anybody want to share any thoughts or kind of experiences that you might have had? We've got a microphone floating around for those who are interested.
I will. When I was 32 years old, my husband and I moved to Germany, and we were in Frankfurt. He went a week ahead of me, and I landed on a Friday, and he said, "I'm so sorry, but I have to go to Prague on Monday for a business trip." And it was like, "That's okay, I can handle that." Well, he worked in Prague for the next 3 years while I worked in Frankfurt. So it was quite a challenge. I studied at the Goethe Institute, and I spoke some German, but not very much. I didn't have any friends. I didn't know anyone at all. I was the only professional woman in the office, so it was very difficult to make friends. I think it took about a year until I felt at home, and then we stayed 5 more years after that.
Wow. Thank you for sharing. How about others? What does it feel like to be new?
Well, yeah, I mean, it was a similar situation for the Guthries, who moved overseas and lived in Tokyo and Hong Kong and Taiwan, and so we were constantly moving, and they don't speak English over there either, so, and it's just hard. It's isolating. Everything's new. No, nobody speaks your language, and it's kind of disorienting, and it's kind of challenging to kind of get your life into order too. So, I always, I've learned to. I know what it's like to feel like, when you're not part of the majority, right? Mm-hmm. So, just huge.
Yeah, thank you. I also moved a lot growing up. I was an Army brat, and so we moved about every 2 years. In fact, I've lived in Chicago for 5 years now, and that's the longest I've ever lived anywhere. And I'm starting to feel at home here now, so it's taken a little while. But I think that's an experience that a lot of us go through, right, in some shape or form throughout our lives. And it is difficult, right? Adjusting to a new life is really challenging, even when you have kind of everything going for you, right? I think about when I first went away to college, how that was kind of scary, but I still had friends at school that I knew. I had family that was supporting me. I had people that were there to kind of cheer me on and help me with any challenges that came up. Same thing moving here. You know, I had support. I had friends. I had family that supported me. And that's not exactly what it's like if you're a refugee, right? You still go through that challenge of being new and experiencing new things, but you don't have all the support systems that are in place for so many of us when we move. So I want to transition just to talking a little bit about what we're going to talk about tonight. I'll turn it over to Sara to kind of run through our agenda for the evening.
We're going to start kind of zoomed out with the international crisis, and that, of course, will include Afghanistan, but it's not limited to that. Then how has the U.S. responded, both historically and today? We'll get into talking about where RefugeeOne comes in, including challenges of COVID-19 for this past year and a half. A couple things that we're looking ahead to in the year to come. And finally, I think a question many of you have is, how can you help? And we're hopeful that there will be some people here who step up to be part of a new group of co-sponsors that's emerging at KUC. And we just need a couple more households to complete that. So.
All right. So I thought we could start just by talking a little bit about our mission at RefugeeOne. This kind of contextualizes the work that we do, and most of what we do works towards this end. But our mission is to create opportunity for refugees who are fleeing war, terror, and persecution to build new lives of safety, dignity, and self-reliance. And that last phrase is what's bolded here in our mission statement. And that's because all of our programs, all of our services, everything that we do is really geared towards that end, trying to help refugee families become self-reliant. They've lost everything, right? And we'll talk more in just a moment about what it means to be a refugee, but refugees have literally lost everything. And to come here and to be able to build a new life and to have the opportunity to support themselves and live as an independent person, you know, have autonomy and not rely on others is a huge opportunity for them. And so that's our goal, is to work towards that end. But what does that actually look like, right? What does it mean to have a life of dignity, safety, and self-reliance? I can share a quick story. I don't know if you have one in mind, but I can share a quick story about a couple that we've been working with the past couple of years. And maybe some of you have heard of them. We have talked about them in a couple of our communications and in our event earlier this year. But their names are Lalia and Bob. And Lalia came as part of a large Congolese family back in 2016 is when her family first arrived. She and her husband Bob had met in the refugee camp where she lived before she came here. And she had lived there for pretty much her whole life, about 20 some odd years that they lived in that refugee camp. She met her husband there. She even got pregnant after they got married. And shortly after that, they found out that she and her family had been approved for resettlement here in Chicago. But because her application had been submitted before she got married, Bob had to stay in the refugee camp and wait for clearance to join her here. So she came here hoping that it would be just a matter of months or, you know, not much time before he joined her. But it ended up being more than 4 years before they were finally reunited. Part of that just because of the challenges that come with family reunification applications in our immigration system here in the US, but also some of it because of the challenges that were implemented under the Trump administration. Finally, after years of trying to petition for him to join her here, this past February, Bob arrived, and he was able to meet his son, Peter Bob, for the first time. He and Lalia are both working at one of our employment partners. It's called the Self-Help Home. It's a retirement community that was originally founded to help survivors or victims from the Holocaust, actually. And so we now have refugees serving former refugees, having the opportunity to work and to build a new life for themselves here. Bob is speaking great English already, but you know, we have services like English classes that are in place to help them learn the language, to help them find work, to help them improve their economic opportunity. Really, all of these programs work together holistically to help a family become self-reliant. And so that's what it looks like. That's what success, I think, looks like for refugee families, is helping them come here and build a new life for themselves.
One thing I love about Lalia's family is they are a family of singers. And if you want to go on our website, there is an incredible music video that the family put together singing the most joyful song that will just stay in your mind on loop for a long time.
Yeah, it's pretty cool. So starting out, we just want to talk a little bit about what causes people to leave their homes. And so what are some reasons that you've heard of people leaving their homes? You can just shout them out.
War. Yeah, we can repeat them.
Yeah, we can repeat them so you don't have to pass them.
No jobs.
Mm-hmm. Sometimes it's by choice, right? Gang violence.
Yep.
Looking for employment.
Climate refugees.
Yeah. Terrorism. Political unrest. Yeah. These are all reasons that people flee their homes. Political unrest, terrorism. I'm going to list some up here on the screen, but we're going to break them into two categories. There's typically two reasons that people leave their home. One because they choose to, or one because they have to. And so when we think about people who choose to leave their home, it's often because they're looking to improve their lives. They're seeking work or educational opportunities, maybe seeking to reunite with their family. But these are people who leave by choice, right? It's an option that they make. They want to leave to pursue a better life for themselves. And then there's another group of people that leave because they're forced to, right? Some of the reasons you just described. Because of persecution or war or violence. It could be because of hunger and poverty, sexual orientation or gender identity discrimination, natural disasters, and climate change is becoming an even bigger reason that refugees are having to flee. So these kind of break into two different groups of people, right? Those who choose to flee and those who are forced to flee. And we're going to talk more about definitions in just a moment. But these are kind of the two categories that we're going to think about. And for most of tonight, we're going to be talking about people who are forced to flee. So those who are forced to flee break down into a couple of different definitions, and I thought it would be helpful just to talk about those definitions briefly now as we get started. The first is a refugee, right? And so RefugeeOne helps mostly refugees. Most of our clients come to the U.S. as refugees. And to be a refugee, that means that you've crossed an international border and you can't return home due to well-founded fear of persecution based on one of several categories. And those are listed here on the screen. It could be race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or membership of a particular social group. So you can't return to your home country because of fear of persecution based on one of those things. That's a refugee. Now, an asylum seeker is somebody who almost meets that definition, but they didn't get refugee status before they sought refuge in another country. So a refugee is granted refugee status, whereas an asylum seeker presents themselves at the border of a country or within a country and requests it there. That's kind of the legal distinction between a refugee and an asylum seeker, but really they're fleeing many of the same things, right?
Can you give us an example of refugee being given the refugee status? Like, where does that come from?
Yeah, so refugee status typically comes from UNHCR, which is the UN Refugee Agency, but you can be granted refugee status if you've crossed an international border and apply for refugee status through UNHCR or one of the other kind of governing bodies for refugees. So a refugee would be like somebody who flees their home in Syria, for example, and finds safety in Turkey and registers to become a refugee there, right, or in a neighboring country. Whereas an asylum seeker is somebody like, for example, somebody who's coming up from Central America and doesn't have refugee status through UNHCR, but still meets that definition and is going to present themselves at the border or from within the country to make that claim and to try and get asylum status.
It could also, an asylum seeker could be someone who came here on a student visa and once they got here sought asylum based on persecution for all the reasons they might have in their home country.
Yeah. So the next category that I'll talk about briefly is internally displaced people. Often people that have been displaced are driven from their homes for the same reasons, but they haven't been able to cross an international border yet, right? So they're still within their own country. And then a stateless person is the last group that I'll talk about. I'll skip over returnee, but stateless people are people who don't have citizenship even in the country where they were born, right? So if you think about Rohingya refugees, for example, who come from Myanmar or Burma, they are considered stateless because they're not offered citizenship or the rights that come along with citizenship, even in the country where they're from. So these are a couple of the important kind of distinctions, but I think the overarching thing here is that these people are fleeing things that are completely out of their control, right? They had to flee their homes for their family's safety and for their own well-being.
Are you saying a refugee has been granted asylum?
A refugee has been granted refugee status. The question is
Refugee status versus asylum status.
Yeah, those are two different things.
Right.
Yeah, similar, but
So when you talk about refugees facing fear of persecution on a whole bunch of things, Does that include literally when you would see these buildings just bombed out and people are fleeing from the bombs of war and that where it's just not safe to be there? Does that fall under that category as well?
It has to be for persecution of one of the things that are listed there. And so if that building is being bombed because it's an attack on a Muslim building or a particular nationality, but it's not general violence, that does not count.
So in Syria, when the country's at civil war, do
People still
get
have to
refuge?
prove a very individualized case of persecution
Okay.
to be given refugee status.
Yeah.
The numbers for these categories are staggering, and this next slide shows 82 million people who have been forcibly displaced around the world. About half of that, or less than half, 26 million. Whoa, sorry. Don't turn around. About 26 million are refugees, including those under the United Nations mandate, and also Palestinian refugees who have a unique category. So 26 million refugees, and the others are largely internally displaced people, 48 million.
Just for context, when I first started doing this work with RefugeeOne about 5.5 years ago, that number, instead of 82.4 million, was at about 68 million. So this continues to escalate, continues to grow every year. The crisis becomes worse and worse. So I think the next question is kind of, where are refugees coming from, right? And there's a lot of places where refugees are coming from, truthfully. The first one that probably comes to mind for most of us is Afghanistan, right? Because it's been in the news lately, the evacuation just happened. And so there are a lot of refugees that are either coming to the US from Afghanistan or who are already here. In fact, about 100,000 or more Afghans were evacuated by the US to either US territories or other countries by the end of August. And this includes about 75,000 parolees and special immigrant visa holders, which are kind of special designations, but they're basically refugees, right? They basically meet that definition. A special immigrant visa holder is typically somebody who's worked for the US forces overseas. And so they might have been an interpreter or a translator or a cultural guide. And because of that, they're now at risk under the new regime, under the Taliban. And they need protection because of that. And so agencies like RefugeeOne are starting to welcome these families already. We started to welcome Afghans about 3 weeks ago. But that's really just, the recent history of our work with individuals from Afghanistan. We've been welcoming families from there since, I think, the early 80s,
Yep.
really. And so this is a continuation of the work that we've been doing with Afghan refugees for quite a while.
To go back to the question, too, about where else refugees are coming from, it's really important that we make sure people remember that that's one country, but Syria continues to have millions of refugees. Burma, the Rohingya, are among the most persecuted people in the world, and Chicago continues to welcome them here. And the Horn of Africa is the third region where there are so many, just today in the news, about South Sudan, as people are fleeing Ethiopia and Eritrea and the Congo. All of these countries have produced millions of refugees, some of whom will find their way here.
Yeah. The red is talking about, so the red is looking at people who don't qualify as refugees. I don't have the key on here, so I don't remember exactly, but I think it's people who don't qualify as refugees and are rather just considered displaced people. I can clarify on that graphic and get back to you, though.
So a few pretty shocking facts about refugees. One is that refugees spend an average of 17 years in camps. The folks that we are resettling today typically have been going through a screening process that took 2 to 3 years. Less than 1% of refugees are ultimately resettled. And many of the people we welcomed have lived in a refugee camp for their entire lives before they came here. Kind of hard to get your mind around those things. 17 years.
All 9 of the children that came in that family that...
The Abedi...
All of the children, there are 9 of them in the family, the Abedi family that Kenilworth Union had a team that supported. They were all born in that refugee camp and had lived there their entire lives. Their parents were young, had probably just recently got married or met there. I don't even know the background, but yeah, they had all their kids there.
Yeah, so kids' only experience of the world before they land here might be a camp like that. We just last week had a pretty amazing event with 2 young women in our youth program, and one of them, we think of her as an Afghan woman, young woman, because that's where her family is from, but she's never been there before. She grew up in Turkey and Tajikistan and Iran, and then came here at age 12, and she said, I'm still sorting out my identity, because Afghanistan doesn't describe it for her, and that's the case for so many.
So for people who have been granted refugee status, for those who match that first definition we talked about, there's typically 3 different options that are available to them, or what we call durable solutions. The first one, and kind of the most preferred, is to return home, right? To be able to return to their own home, where their families are, to their own culture. But that's not always possible, because some of these conflicts and wars are long-lasting and very prolonged. And because of that, some people won't ever have the opportunity to safely return home. And so if you can't safely return home, the next option, and kind of the second most common, is to stay in the country where you sought refuge, right? So for example, if somebody flees Syria and seeks refuge in Jordan, they might be able to have rights there. They might be able to go to school and work and actually build a new life for themselves. And so that's the second durable solution, is to stay where you've sought refuge, if that's a safe option for you. But sometimes that's not an option either, because you might continue to be persecuted even in the country where you've sought refuge. This is especially true for Rohingya refugees who flee Burma. Many of them go to places like Malaysia to seek safety. And while they're able to find temporary shelter there and refuge from the persecution, they're not able to work. They're not able to go to school. They're not able to actually have any quality of life. And so the last option that remains, if you're not able to safely return home or stay in the country where you've sought refuge, is to be resettled. Resettlement is kind of the third and final option. And like Sarah just shared, only 1% of refugees will ever be resettled. So this is really reserved for the most vulnerable, those people who can't find any other solutions to their problems.
This next slide shows a history of the U.S. From 1980, when, during the Reagan administration, we had an all-time high ceiling, the blue line, of nearly 240,000 refugees were going to be welcomed in. So there are so many refugees I know who arrived in that period who absolutely love Ronald Reagan because he changed their lives. It has dropped over the years and climbed up. The orange line shows the actual number of admitted refugees. And so generally that tracks fairly well. You'll notice in 2001, after 9/11, the refugee program came to a complete halt for most of a year. And so that's the largest gap. The other thing you'll notice is these last 4 years, when the number went from what was typically 85,000 on average a year, down and down and down, until last year, under the Trump administration, the ceiling was set at 15,000 refugees, while these numbers that Jim's quoted, about 80 million people in need, while that number grew. President Biden most recently has announced a ceiling this year for 125,000 refugees. And we're hopeful that the international system hasn't been completely destroyed. The pipeline, the people whose jobs it was to interview and vet and carefully review every refugee applicant. So much of that infrastructure internationally has been taken apart over the last 4 years that it may be hard to achieve 125,000, but we're hopeful the government will work towards that. There's a microphone.
And then, how does that work vis-a-vis the Afghan folks that are coming in? Those are all incremental?
The Afghan parolee program will be in addition to, and that number, I think, did I hear 45,000 recently?
75,000
75
is what I've heard, yeah.
For the Afghan parolee program. That would be in addition to the 125. These are ceilings. There is important legislation that we hope will pass that a lot of groups are working on nationally to also create a floor of 50,000 so that the president can't whimsically decide to destroy this program, but that there would be something that we as a nation are committed to no matter who's in the White House.
So we'll pause here, see if there's any questions about anything we've talked about so far before we start digging into really what RefugeeOne does and where we come into the picture.
Lorraine.
So why are they called parolees?
I don't know.
It's a good question. It's mostly a legal distinction. So there are several ways that Afghans are able to come to the U.S. right now. One is through being a special immigrant visa holder, right? That's who I described earlier, people who have worked for the U.S. forces and are granted that status because of that. Parolees are basically people who meet the definition of a refugee, but for some reason there's never been a refugee program developed for Afghanistan. It was actually, my understanding is it was stopped in, I think shortly after 9/11 is what Melina had told me. I'm not sure on those details, but I know that currently there's not a refugee program for Afghanistan. And so they had to come as parolees instead of with refugee status because that program didn't exist.
And I'll add that it's humanitarian parolee is the official title. It's also the title we use for Haitians who have tried to come to the U.S. They have a unique program.
So
Chris.
if the ceiling is 75,000 for Afghanistan people, refugees from Afghanistan, where are the rest of them going? Because we've already gotten out numbers higher than that and are still working to get other people out. Are other countries stepping up here?
Well, those will also include, and there are a lot of terms here. I just want to acknowledge that 75,000 humanitarian parolees from Afghanistan. There are also the special immigrant visas, people who worked for the U.S. government for 2 or more years. And that's a good number of the people that were evacuated.
And the other thing I read is that there's often these really large families and extended families. Is there sort of a limit that it's either your children or your elderly parents, or is it even broader than that when you say family?
It's often blood relation. I mean, it is a very marriage and blood relation. And so it's interesting. There are many families that have those ties and come as large families. They might see themselves as a family of 15. Here, they might be defined as 5 families. But they do all come together. And we have welcomed a family of 12 on Saturday, a family of 9 last Wednesday. So there are large, and they're all connected through marriage and blood.
Can you just share statistics now on the numbers that you're dealing with and waiting on for vetting and clearance?
In terms of overall refugees or just Afghans?
Overall, for your organization.
For Refugee
for our
One.
organization.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
Sure. So we are hoping this year that we are going to resettle about 800 refugees. That will be half Afghans, officially parolees coming through this program, who are arriving in earnest right now. And then the other half will be from these other primary countries in Africa and possibly Burma and certainly Syria. Those are the largest areas that we're likely to resettle.
And they've been awaiting this 2 to 4 year process of completion.
2 to 4 to 25-year process. Yep.
One of the other things that's kind of important to point out is that, we've talked about how African refugees often spend prolonged periods of time in refugee camps. That's not true for the Afghans we were helping, right? They have just recently fled their home. And so I think it's an important point to remember that refugees come from very diverse backgrounds, right? Just because you have refugee status doesn't mean you have a shared experience with somebody else who has refugee status. You could have fled for different reasons. You could have grown up in a refugee camp. You could have been an urban refugee. There's a lot of different kind of stories that are all tied up in that title of refugee.
Can I just ask, how do refugees actually get assigned to RefugeeOne, or how do you end up getting a particular family?
So, and some of this will lead us into the next part of the conversation, but the question is, how are refugees assigned to a particular place like Chicago? And there's this meeting every Tuesday of 9 national agencies that get together, look at all of the cases that have been approved to come to the U.S. If somebody has a family member in Los Angeles, then they're likely to go to L.A. They will go to L.A. or to wherever their family or U.S. tie is. But otherwise, they can be assigned fairly randomly. And we have a former board member of ours, a Congolese refugee, who said he didn't know he was in Chicago till he got here, had no idea where he was going to land, and only had the image of Chicago as being a very cold place, which it fulfilled its promise. So for the Afghans who are coming, many of them, there are very strong Afghan-American communities that exist right now in California, both north and south, in the D.C. area, Virginia, Maryland, and in Texas. And so most refugees from Afghanistan are hoping to move to one of those places, but there's only so much that those cities can absorb. And at some point, then, people are being assigned to all of the other agencies that are able and willing to welcome them. All of the folks that we've resettled so far, almost without exception, had no U.S. tie. So they are arriving in Chicago without knowing a single person. And it will be really important that they have the extra support of community members to help them navigate. So maybe this, I think, will shift well into our work, and we'll have time for more questions, but to talk more about where RefugeeOne comes into this story. And just a few highlights about this organization that we've been around now for 40 years and have resettled 18,000 refugees from around the world. Within that first year, almost everyone we work with is already self-reliant, which is incredible when you imagine going to a new country, learning a new language, and making ends meet and providing for your family. That is in large part thanks to nearly 1,000 volunteers that are with us as co-sponsors and mentors and tutors, 150 local businesses, a lot of names that you'd know, from Tyson Chicken is a big one, Imperfect Produce is another. A lot of our employers work in food manufacturing, like those examples, but also hospitality and travel. Before COVID, so many of our employees were working at O'Hare in various roles, from cleaning airplanes to helping people in wheelchairs. So businesses play a critical role in helping give refugees a chance to earn a paycheck and provide. And our staff, which is amazing, about 50 of us at this point, speak 35 languages. Our boss speaks 5 of them. And she herself was a refugee resettled by us about 40 years ago. So this next question is one to reflect on, is what's the support that refugees need as you imagine and remember your own experiences of moving to a new place? And just shout out answers and we'll repeat them. Housing. Languages.
Money.
Absolutely money. Need money to buy a cell phone or a SIM card. Right. They'll need education in English and also cultural education, navigating.
A job.
They'll need a job.
Household goods.
Household goods, everything that you can think of in your kitchen.
Friends.
They'll need friends. Absolutely. These are the things that RefugeeOne, and they'll need health care.
And mental health care, so important.
And we're lucky, Chicago is one of the places with outstanding health care. And so refugees with important medical needs are often assigned to Chicago because we can provide for them here. So you listed off pretty much everything here. And these are the things that RefugeeOne does in partnership with the schools, with the employers, with volunteers, starting out with finding housing and having it ready and set up when a family arrives, getting them enrolled in English classes. And for many people, if they're pre-literate or a very, very basic beginning literacy, that's the perfect place to come to RefugeeOne, because then we can help take it to the next level. Others arrive already speaking some English, and then we'll get them enrolled over at Truman College or another community college near them for English classes so they can advance it. Our employment team is critical in helping people find jobs, ideally living wage jobs, where they can get to on public transit, because our clients are resettled on the north side of Chicago, mostly in the West Ridge neighborhood, Rogers Park and Albany Park. So, because a lot of the lakefront areas up north are increasingly too expensive for refugees to afford. Healthcare, like you mentioned, and mental health care. And this is one of the things that I think is a particularly important offering that we have. RefugeeOne has a wellness staff with licensed clinical social workers and interpreters who speak 35 languages, so that people can overcome not only the trauma that they experienced abroad, but also the trauma of arriving here and adjusting to all of this change, to living in poverty, and not knowing how to support their kids in school and navigate this new world. And so our mental health program is a critical addition that we built just 10 years ago, and we are so grateful for private support that keeps that going. Our youth program is amazing, and it's going over to the after-school program is a lot like a mini UN. Kids from all over the world that create friendships that last a lifetime, and also helps those kids catch up in school, because a child is assigned to school not based on any of their education or how they've tested on anything, but on their age only. So if you're a 14-year-old child you're starting high school here in Chicago. And can you imagine what that must be like when you're still learning English and you're giving assignments that are just devastating to try to understand? So our youth program works with those kids, matches them with tutors, helps, creates a really lively summer camp every year so the kids are learning important things and also discovering what a great place Chicago can be. And we're excited that we'll have that youth program in our new building instead of separate. Immigration assistance is helping reunite families, helping people apply for green cards, and ultimately, after 5 years in this country, refugees are eligible for citizenship. And so we want to help them succeed on that test and to learn all of the history that many of us would fail at our first go around, to get them geared up for that test and for that very emotional swearing-in ceremony. And finally, as someone had mentioned, that friendship and social connection. That is such an important part of the work we do, and friendships between volunteers and refugees often last for decades. And we know refugee children who were named for volunteers that had co-sponsored them and been with them at the airport. And they help with all of these things, learning public transportation, how to manage your finances, navigating a new school, all of those things.
So there's a lot of challenges that refugees face when they first get here, right? Some of them are listed here, right? These are not easy things to do, to learn a new language, to adjust to a new work environment, to go to school, especially if you're still learning the language or you've never attended school before. So all of these things are difficult obstacles for refugees to overcome. But of course, COVID-19 presented a whole new set of obstacles, right? A new set of challenges. And refugees, especially early on in the pandemic, were one of the hardest hit communities. Even here in Chicago, we know that's true because Westridge, which is a neighborhood that's welcoming to refugees, most of the refugee families we work with live in that area, was one of the hardest hit neighborhoods early on in the pandemic. And refugees have faced a whole number of challenges because of COVID-19. Everything from the risks that come from not speaking the language, right? We were getting reports from refugees that we work with prior to the vaccine even being a point of conversation, people saying somebody came to my house or called me and offered me medication for COVID-19 or a cure for COVID-19. So because they don't speak the language, they fall victim to scammers, right? That can be one of the challenges. So it's really important that they have access to people like our staff who can give them real-time information in their own language and make sure that they're understanding important public health and safety information. Of course, many refugees, like Sara said, had to continue to work on the front lines during the pandemic. And so that increased their anxiety around exposure to the virus at work and on public transportation as they're traveling to and from work. Others who weren't working on the front lines may have experienced layoffs or unemployment or a loss of wages. And of course, the financial challenges and struggle that come from that, right, of not being fully employed in an expensive city like Chicago. For youth, e-learning or remote learning was a big challenge. It's already difficult to go to a new school and to adjust and to try and catch up with your peers academically and socially. But they had to do that doing remote learning, right? And imagine how difficult that is for kids who have never used a computer before or who are just getting acquainted with technology. Lots of challenges there. And of course, we've seen an increased need for mental health support, which we're really, really fortunate to be able to offer to the refugees we work with.
So as we're looking ahead, as I mentioned, this next year, we hope to welcome 800 refugees. And to give you some context for that, we typically have welcomed about 500 in a year. At the end of the Obama administration, we welcomed 750. At the end of the Trump administration, we welcomed less than 50. So 800 means scaling up in a very serious way. We are so fortunate that we have had a lot of private support over these 4 years, that we've been able to sustain our core staff and not lose the expertise that we need for this moment that we're in now. And so we are fast and furious looking for apartments all throughout these areas of Chicago, getting them set up. People, churches like Winnetka Congregational just did a major drive for us on Saturday and delivered prayer rugs and pressure cookers and pots that Afghans are going to want to cook in, which was a wonderful gift to bring. But also, obviously, all of the other countries that we are prepared for. The other thing we're looking ahead to is building our future home. And that is an image of the building. Some of you are at an event we realized was almost a year ago today. COVID has this time warp way And if you thought we were in our building, we are not yet, but we are really looking forward to it. And begin construction, the demolition part, and then into construction, hopefully by Monday. That's the rain slowed it down. It was supposed to be even sooner. It's at the corner of California and Peterson. It's a great location, and this is a very big deal for us. We've been renting for all of our history in a historic building in Uptown, and after about 36 years there, the rents had been increasing all over, and new owners of the building decided to turn it into upscale rental units. And so every nonprofit in that building was scurrying about looking for new housing. Thankfully, a donor heard about our plight on WBEZ and gave us a building, a temporary spot that's our home right now while we build a future home. And the current building is about a third the size of what we need, so most of us are working remote. But one of the really thrilling parts of the temporary home is it had a dental clinic in it, fully equipped, with 3 dental bays. One of the dreams that we've always had was to provide dental care to refugees, and now we have begun that in partnership with UIC's College of Dentistry and a lot of volunteer dentists. And that work has begun. It's in its pilot phase, so it's not regular hours yet. But when we move into our future home, less than a year from now, we'll hopefully be doing that in earnest at that point. So that is something we are very excited about, and you'll be hearing more, especially in the springtime as we're building a public campaign around that.
And we are looking for volunteer dentists, hygienists, and so if you know anybody who recently retired and might want to volunteer. No, we are really excited to be able to offer this service, though. It's a real need. You know, what we've heard so far from the pilot testing that we've been doing with the dental work is that these are needs that have gone unmet for years, right? These people have never, ever had dental care. And the dental problems they're running into are different from the dental problems they've seen with other populations they've worked with. I was really interested as I spoke with the dentist recently who said they're not seeing a lot of the problems that come from eating sugary foods, right? The types of problems you see with American teeth problems. But it's other issues, right, that are completely unrelated. So I was interested to learn that. But yeah, it's a great service that we're able to offer now.
So we've got about 10 minutes left. I think we will skip this video because I have a feeling there are a lot of questions in this crowd still. But we do want to wrap up by talking about what you can do and then take more questions from you. First one, obviously, is to donate. There are huge expenses that we are incurring right now in finding apartments, setting them up, paying the deposits. And imagine finding an apartment for someone who has no work history, no social security number, no rental references, and no income.
No credit.
No credit. So all of these things, finding an apartment for them, we pay the deposit, and then we'll pay, if they were to arrive right now, we would pay the rest of October's rent, all of November, December, January. In February, they'd be responsible for part of their rent, and by March, they will be responsible for their rent. So it's a pretty quick time for them to earn the income that they need to take that on. And donations to RefugeeOne, by and large, the largest expense that we have aside from staff is paying those expenses.
Sarah,
Yes.
what happens if after 6 months they're not ready, they're not capable of paying their own rent?
So Catherine's question is, what happens if after that 6 months they're not capable? We have worked very hard to avoid that outcome, but there are some situations where there might be a single parent or only one parent is able to work because of health issues of another parent, and where the kids, oftentimes a teenager will choose, instead of continuing school, they're going to help their family by working on a GED and working to earn money. So that's one way that families become self-reliant. We also partner with other agencies that can extend emergency rent when the family is working towards this. And there are exceptions that we make too when we realize, this family needs another month or two because it's not possible for them to do it on their own yet.
I'm just wondering, do you own any buildings, or have you thought about, not that you want to be in the property management business, but I mean, that gives you more control with housing if you bought a 6-flat or something. Is that something that's ever been thought of?
I think your point about not wanting to be in the property management business is exactly right. And it's something that we have considered at different times in our history and consistently decided against. We do have the master lease on one building, And that's working with a property management company that does all of the property management, but we know we have control over all of the units there. And so as families are ready to move on, we've got another apartment we can set up. And that's been really helpful to have a guaranteed stock of housing in one location. And we've had people offer to buy houses for us, and realizing that that also is not actually the most helpful, particularly when people are offering beautiful homes that a family won't be able to afford the rent on when the day comes when they need to move out. And so we work with local landlords to find the housing.
One other reason we do that also is because, we want refugees to come here and be autonomous and live in their own space, right? Have their own home. And so if we were renting out, a big apartment building and just giving people their first year there and then saying you need to go find your own apartment, that's not that warm welcome, right? Of knowing that where you land is where you can stay. And so I think that's one of the problems we've had with this building we have the master lease on, is families get there and then you don't want to kick them out, right? I think that's an issue we've had.
Yep.
And so, that's the other issue, is we want to make sure that people are being welcomed into a space that they can grow into and stay in.
Could you share now or after we go through the list, what are the responsibilities of a co-sponsor team?
Yes. Okay, so this, and we'll send the video too. We are hoping to share the slides with you all and this video, because it'll inspire you to be part of a co-sponsor team. But we actually have people here who can give some testimony to what's involved. I see Bev; she's moved by the Spirit. I see several people. But is there a microphone for Bev?
Testimony. Yes.
Preach.
Is it on?
Yes.
Okay. I was telling Bill when I came in that I'm 81 years old and I have had an amazing adventure-filled life with lots of wonderful adventures and exciting things happening. But when I think about it, one of the most amazing things was our work with several of you, with our Abedi family of 11 people who had lived in a refugee camp for 17 years. And we took them on. It was an extraordinary experience, not just because of them, because how brave they were, but all the people in this church and people who weren't in this church or not religious. We had a huge group of people helping. I feel like those people all of them are my 2:00 in the morning friends. If I needed something, I could call any one of our co-sponsors at 2 in the morning. We just became such a team. And it wasn't like it was always easy, because we had different ideas and different abilities and different foibles. But boy, it was such an incredible thing. We worked so hard together. And our family, we adored our family, and we just gave a big wedding present to the oldest daughter, Maua, who has a baby and is married. And it goes on and on. Great experience. Go for it, people.
Thank you, Bev. That's an incredible statement. 81 years, and this is a highlight of a lifetime. Wow. Anybody else want to speak about? I can give the basics, though, for the question. A co-sponsorship team basically commits to 2 or 3 things. One that's required is fundraising, $8,000 to $12,000 per refugee family. That money supports their rent and their deposit and those initial expenses that I described. Second component is optional, and that's setting up their apartment. And that means gathering all of the furniture, all the household goods. And we have a list that's on our website, and then we have a Google version that makes it easy to track. And Kenilworth Union has a group of people that says we're doing all of the above. The third component where the help is particularly needed is with the mentor team. And this is a group of typically 4 to 5 families. In your case, it was more because it was a very large family that you were co-sponsoring. But 4 to 5 families who commit to mentoring. That means they're going to rotate, and they're going to typically visit about once a month for 6 months. They're going to stay very tightly knit in conversations. So if you guys were to go this Sunday and notice that the family is struggling with math and needing to understand better how to use money, then you're going to pass the baton to the next group and say, I recommend you go to the store and practice using money or purchasing these items that I know they need. And so staying connected and knowing about what struggles they're going through, what things are going well, occasionally doing gatherings where everyone gets together for a beautiful day in the park to celebrate, or go to the zoo and take the family there. So those are it's a 6-month commitment. This mentor team, because right now we have a number of groups that are in the queue, we're thinking that Kenilworth would probably be matched with a family around March. And that's hard to estimate, so give or take 2 months on either side. But that's when the work would begin for the following 6 months. And Jennifer Lind, whose email address is there, is the person to contact if this is something that might be interesting. And you can also give me a wink tonight, because that would be very encouraging for Jennifer to know. What was that? Are you winking at me, Chris? No. Just trying to breathe a little. Yeah. Joan.
You know, I just wanted to make a point that I admired from afar Bev's team. It was amazing what you guys did, and you had probably one of the most challenging families RefugeeOne has had, right? But they're not all like that. And I just wanted to make that comment because I was part of a Rotary team that sponsored a refugee family from Iraq. The couple was highly educated. They had 2 little kids. We got him, he was an engineer. We got him a job right away at a plant, and he moved on from there. He was an Uber driver. They became independent very quickly. Their needs for us were more social than anything. I mean, once we helped him get a job, everything else fell in place. So I just kind of wanted to make the point that RefugeeOne really has a broad range of families that they help, and their needs really vary dramatically.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Other questions?
I would just say one thing. I think that is an excellent point, because we were aware of, you know, different situations, and all of a sudden it's like, hey, will you take this family of 11? And, you know, we did a little soul searching, because if we were going to be in, we were going to be all in. But I would, if you had that opportunity come up again, I would take it.
I would too.
And I would do it because one of the things we learned very quickly, and Bev kind of used this line frequently when we were trying to decide, do we do this or not? She's like, it's not us who. We have resources, we have time, and we know how to get other people to help. And that really was kind of key to being able to do this, because this was a family with 0 education, with kids from 2 to 17, and teenagers are teenagers. They may not have the same education, but they behave the way they behave and the things they want. And the same thing with little kids. They're more similar than different. They needed a lot of support, but it was joyful. They were a family that could sing and be happy, and here we're witnessing poverty on a different level than we've ever come close to experiencing, and how difficult it is to do basic stuff when you're really poor. But they're sort of going with it, and they are trying and appreciative, and it couldn't have been a more rewarding experience. I think we got out as much of it as they did, and we still stay in contact with them.
Wow. Kenilworth, it's amazing. And that was the 3rd of 3 families in 3 years that you were part of and welcomed, and each so different, like you pointed out. Well, are there other questions, the other things that we have here on ways to get involved? We do hope that we'll get your email addresses, and we'd like you to sign up so that we can stay in touch if you're not already. That will make sure you know about advocacy opportunities. If you have connections with housing in the city, in those areas that I described, or employers with jobs in the city, ideally on public transit, people without a lot of language skills, and also higher language skills, because we do think a lot of the Afghans who are arriving will speak English, and that's going to open up a lot more opportunities for them. So I guess these last slides include this and our contact information, so you can get in touch, but I will put this out to take email addresses. Let's take a couple more questions then.
Are you on the housing?
How challenged on the house?
And
it's limited. Yep, it really is. The family, and when a large family is arriving, so this Afghan family of 9 that arrived Wednesday, there's not an apartment that's large enough. And so we had to set up 3 apartments. 2 married couples in one apartment, a mom and her 3 kids in another, and then a single older son who had a studio. So that's a lot of rent, and it's setting up all of those kitchens and all of those, supplies that they need. So finding housing, particularly for some of these larger families, is a big challenge.
Are the Maoris still in their same apartment? Can you speak to that?
This is a question about the Syrian refugee family
so
that resettled.
Roger's asking if our family, who's the Syrian family, they are in a different apartment than they were originally settled in. They had more complicated needs because they have a daughter who has cerebral palsy. And so they ended up in an apartment where there were 2 flights of stairs to get to their apartment. And as the daughter grew, became taller and larger, it was very hard for them to carry her up and down the stairs. So now they're in about 3 blocks away. And they still have stairs, but not 2 flights. It's only about 6 or 7 to get in the door. But it was fun. They were super excited that they found their own place, that wasn't provided. And it was fun to see them, be proud of where they're living and that kind of thing, too. So.
One last question? Then we want to thank you for taking the time to be here tonight, and those who are on Zoom with us or on YouTube. And for your questions and for the work you've done and for the work I hope you will continue to feel nudged towards doing tonight. I hope Bev's words and Chris's words echo in your ears as you think about maybe being involved and working with this new team, because it will be a very meaningful experience. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
It's a lot of pointing, and just go to a foreign country and you're trying to explain something that you need something. It's kind of like that. It's drawing things, it's showing pictures.
Yeah, just last
the kids
weekend.
pick things up a lot faster than the adults. But the Betty was pretty good. Cynthia was much slower than other. Betty's the father. We call the Betty family because all the children's last name is the father's first.